First Amendment law, First Amendment to the Constitution, which is an amendment that has to do with freedom of speech. The First Amendment says that people have freedom of speech, that the state cannot abridge one's freedom of speech. Now, the Supreme Court has said that there are time, place, and manner restrictions to freedom of speech. Police officers enforce the time, place, and manner restriction. So you can't go in the middle of rush hour and block traffic. That's a time, a place, and a manner restriction. So those are the areas where police come in and enforce the limits of people's personal rights.
The First Amendment protects what people often say is freedom of speech. Sometimes they'll say freedom of the press. It mentions both speech and press, but these days we tend to think of it a little bit more broadly. We call it freedom of expression, because just as I can speak to you right now and say things and communicate, I can also communicate using gestures. For example, oh, what does that mean, right? There are other ones, ruder gestures I could use as well, but they express something. The fact that I'm wearing a tie today indicates that I'm here in a professional capacity. So even the things that I wear express something. The clothing, everything about you expresses it. Why is this considered to be so important? There are a number of reasons, and I think one of the obvious ones is that we have a majoritarian system of government, and if you can't debate policy, and if you can't debate the merits of various politicians, then you can't have a majoritarian Republican form of government. Perhaps the most important aspect of speech, the freedom of speech, however, is implicit, or at least it's often overlooked. And this is one I've done a great deal of thinking about over the years, because it sounds touchy-feely, but ultimately I've come to the conclusion it really and truly is the most important aspect of it. Freedom of speech protects freedom of thought. Now, speech and thought are two different things. Speech expression is communication. You can have entirely private thoughts that you never communicate to anybody, and I'm not going to say they're without value. They do have value, but their value is limited. It's limited to you. It happens all inside your head. But the moment you start expressing one of those ideas, then it becomes expression, becomes speech. Similarly, you can be completely isolated from other people's ideas, and that can have a negative impact on your own thinking. In fact, think about this. Scientific progress typically takes place because scientists get together and talk about ideas. So expression and thought are inextricably intertwined.
The tension between personal liberty and broader state interest or societal interest is illustrated really well, I think, in the context of, at least more recently in Virginia, Capitol protesters, or elsewhere, occupiers, where people have chosen to express themselves typically peacefully and to articulate ideas that are often critical of the government and often offensive to law enforcement actors. But because they do it peacefully and generally orderly, and because they submit to reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, which is what the Supreme Court tells us we must do in order to regulate that expression constitutionally, they're allowed to do it. It becomes problematic when you have more isolated occurrences between a citizen and an officer, and the citizen decides that he or she is going to exercise their First Amendment right of speech or press in the middle of a police encounter. And the exercise of that right obstructs or somehow impedes the officer's exercise of his or her duty. And then the officer has to make a real-time effort to balance the two in the least obtrusive way possible. You see it often in news reports of citizen encounters where the citizen wants to challenge the officer's exercise of authority, or a citizen wants to get closer to record an encounter. And that proximity is either unsafe or frankly disruptive. And it plays out in real time, this effort to strike the balance, this give and take between that person's personal liberty and the state's interest in responding to the crime or the incident.
By and large, the First Amendment prevents the government, certainly including the police, from regulating the content of our speech. But there are some exceptions. One exception is so-called incitement. Let's say there's a crowd, let's say there's a speaker, and the speaker is whipping the crowd up into a frenzy. Well, that's fine, that's what speakers do. That's how they make their points. But if ever the speaker gets to the point of whipping the crowd up into such a frenzy that there is an imminent likelihood of serious criminal conduct, especially violent acts, then that can be prohibited. In fact, it is prohibited in most jurisdictions, and the police can make an arrest. It's primarily a public safety issue at that point. One other exception to the general concept that free expression is protected by the Constitution is the so-called true threat. You can't actually threaten someone in a way that is going to create a real apprehension, a real fear in that person. Threats are very dangerous and upsetting things, and they cause real harm. The best teaching case there is for this, as far as I'm aware, is something called Virginia versus Black. It's from the early 2000s, and it involved two similar but very distinct circumstances. Circumstance number one, people are driving along a road, they look up, and there in a field is a big burning cross. And it turns out that the Ku Klux Klan is having a rally. Well, Virginia has a criminal statute saying that it's a crime to burn a cross. So the Klan members are arrested. That's case number one. Case number two also involves the same statute, involves a burning cross. This time, however, the cross is much smaller. It's just a couple of, I think, pieces of furniture that have been tied together, soaked with gasoline, but then placed on the front lawn of an African-American family. Arrests in both cases. Now, case number one, case dismissed, because it's protected core political speech. As reprehensible as it is core political speech when the Klan gets up and burns its cross, which is generally recognized as a sign of white supremacy and hatred directed toward Catholics or Jews or African Americans. Case number two. Well, the people in case number two crossed a line. They literally crossed a line. They went into the yard of the family nearby. And it's widely understood that when someone burns a cross in your front yard, right in front of your window, that there's a threat, and the threat is get out or you or your family will come to harm. That's a true threat. That can be penalized, so case upheld.